Michael stepped into my kitchen 3 days after we buried Robert. His voice flat and cold. "Mom, now that Dad's gone, you should sell this house." He didn't ask how I was doing or if I'd slept. Vanessa stood behind him, her perfume lingering as her eyes swept over the walls, the ceiling, the garden outside, like she was already deciding what to strip away. They didn't sit. My coffee sat untouched on the counter, the steam long gone, but my hands stayed wrapped around the cup, bracing for the next thing they might take from me. For a second, I thought I had misheard him. My fingers tightened around the arm of the chair. I looked at his face, waiting for some hint that it was a joke, a poorly timed attempt to break the tension of grief. But his expression didn't change. Vanessa took off her sunglasses and set them on the side table, glancing at Michael as if to say, "Keep going." My mouth felt dry. The clock on the wall ticked louder than usual. "This house is too much for you now," Michael continued. "You could get a nice condo in town closer to stores, no stairs to worry about. It would be safer." I didn't answer. My eyes drifted to the hallway where the photos still hung. Robert in his work shirt. Chloe's gap-toothed smile from second grade. Our wedding picture with the sun too bright in our faces. I thought about the years spent in this place, the repairs Robert had made with his own hands, the mornings we'd shared coffee at the kitchen table. Vanessa spoke next, her tone lighter, almost coaxing. "You'd love it, Eleanor. No maintenance, no lawn to worry about. You could make new friends." I let the silence stretch. My heart was pounding, but my face stayed still. The hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen seemed louder than their voices. Michael shifted his weight, glancing toward the dining room like he was already picturing it empty. I wanted to tell him this was the place I'd built my life in, that every corner held a piece of Robert and me. I wanted to tell him the smell of sawdust still lingered in the basement from the shelves Robert built last winter, that the porch creaked in the same spot it always had, and I loved it that way. But the words didn't come. Instead, I met his gaze and held it. The weight of that look was all I could give in that moment. I didn't need to answer, not yet. His jaw tightened, just slightly, as if my refusal to respond was more irritating than an argument would have been. "We'll talk about it later," he said finally, with a small smile that didn't reach his eyes. They stayed for only a few minutes more, making small talk about the weather, Chloe's classes, things that barely touched the air between us. When they left, the sound of the door closing felt final. I stayed where I was, listening to the crunch of gravel under the SUV's tires until it faded down the street. The room was quiet again, but not the kind of quiet that brings peace. It was the kind that settles in your chest and makes it hard to breathe. I reached for the edge of Robert's old cardigan draped over the back of the couch and pulled it around my shoulders. My eyes lingered on the doorway where Michael had stood, the space he'd filled with his plans for my future. In that stillness, something small but solid took root inside me. It wasn't rage, not yet. It was the recognition that this house, this life was mine, and no one was going to take it from me without a fight. I pushed myself up from the chair and started walking slowly toward the kitchen, my hand brushing the wall as I went. The paint there was smooth in some spots, worn in others, each patch, telling a story I could still remember. I paused in the doorway to the dining room, letting my eyes rest on the solid oak table Robert had built when Michael was just a boy. He had measured and cut every piece himself, sanding until the wood felt like silk. The chairs were a little wobbly now, but they still held the warmth of countless family meals. I moved into the hallway and stopped in front of the wall with the faint scratch near the baseboard. Chloe had made that mark when she was 6, dragging her little pink suitcase during a sleepover. Robert had laughed instead of scolding her, saying the house needed a few imperfections to feel alive. My fingers traced the groove, and I could almost hear his voice again. In the living room, the wedding photo sat in its frame, the edges a bit faded from years of sunlight streaming through the window. Robert's tie was crooked that day, and my veil had snagged on the church door, but we were laughing, our faces tilted toward each other in a way that felt effortless. I straightened the frame, brushing away a fine layer of dust, and for a moment the ache in my chest deepened. The kitchen smelled faintly of coffee, though I hadn't made any that morning. Robert had been the one to brew it most days, whistling off-key as he filled our mugs. I could still see him leaning against the counter in his robe, reading the paper while I scrambled eggs. In summer, we would carry our breakfast out to the porch, the sound of him chuckling at something in the paper mixing with the creak of the boards beneath our chairs. The thought of Michael picturing this space gutted and staged for strangers felt like a slap. These weren't just rooms. They were the shape of our lives. Every nick in the floor, every smudge on the wall was a reminder that we had lived fully here. The idea of reducing it all to square footage and resale value made my stomach tighten. I climbed the short staircase to Robert's study. The air was still as if it had been holding its breath since the day he left it for the last time. His desk was neat, in the way only he could manage, with papers stacked by size and pens lined up in a mug Chloe had made him in kindergarten. The smell of cedar from the old bookcase mingled with the faint scent of his aftershave that seemed to linger in the air. I picked up a small brass paperweight shaped like an eagle, one he had found at a flea market years ago. It was cool in my hand, heavy for its size, and I set it back exactly where it had been. I pulled a cloth from the drawer and began dusting the shelves, moving slowly, careful not to disturb the order he had kept. As I wiped the top shelf, my eyes caught on a thin, cream-colored envelope tucked inside the family ledger that sat upright against the wall. The flap was worn. The paper softened with age. I pulled it free and turned it over, recognizing the logo of the local bank. It wasn't sealed. Sliding the papers out, I saw the faint blue ink of a statement from years ago, along with a handwritten note in Robert's careful script. I didn't read it right away. I just stood there holding it, feeling the weight of it in my hands. It was the kind of thing you don't come across by accident, the kind that seems to wait for the right moment to be found. I set it gently on the desk, the dust cloth still in my other hand, and looked out the window toward the yard, where the maple tree was just beginning to bud. The study felt different now, as if it had shifted somehow. I took a slow breath and reached for the chair, pulling it back to sit. The envelope lay between my hands, the paper cool against my palms. Outside, a gust of wind rattled the porch screen again, and the sound seemed to settle something inside me. I knew I would open it, but not just yet. I carried the envelope downstairs and set it on the kitchen counter, meaning to come back to it later. Again. The afternoon light was slanting in through the blinds, catching the dust motes in the air, and I suddenly thought about the old file cabinet in the corner of the laundry room. I had not opened it in months. The thought of it made me uneasy, but my feet were already moving. The cabinet was wedged between the dryer and the back wall, its beige paint chipped along the edges. I knelt down, my knees protesting, and pulled open the bottom drawer. The familiar smell of old paper rose up, a mix of ink and time. There it was, tucked in the back, my navy blue financial ledger with the bent corners. I placed it on top of the dryer and flipped it open. The pages were filled with my handwriting, line after line of dates and amounts. My stomach tightened as my eyes began to move over the entries. March 2014. $20,000 for Michael's down payment on his house. October 2015. $6,200 for Chloe's tuition that semester. April 2016, $4,000 for braces. September 2018. $10,000 for the roof repair. When Michael said he had no savings left. July 2019, $3,500 for their anniversary trip to Florida. January 2021, $2,500 for Vanessa's continuing education course, the one she never finished. Scattered between the big numbers were dozens of smaller ones. 200 here, 500 there, each marked with a casual note. Temporary loan, just until payday. Help with car repair. Grocery money. Added up, the smaller entries totaled $39,400. I ran my finger down the column and felt a cold flush rise up my neck. I remembered each time they had called the urgency in Michael's voice, the way I had set aside my own needs without thinking. I had skipped replacing my winter coat one year, put off fixing the back steps for two, stopped going to the salon. It had been so easy to tell myself it was love, that it was what family did. Looking at it now, the numbers told a different story. Mom, I flipped back further. The first few years after Robert retired, the pages were empty. We had managed just fine on our pensions and his part-time consulting work. Then the requests began. A few $100s here and there, and I had told Robert not to worry. He had frowned, but let it go. By the time the bigger amount started, I was handling the finances alone, and I had stopped mentioning them to him. The ache in my chest deepened, not from grief this time, but from something sharper. I pressed my lips together, breathing slowly. It wasn't just the money. It was the assumption that I would always say yes, that I would always put them first, no matter what it cost me. I turned to the most recent page. The last entry was from December 2022. $1,500 for Christmas gifts they had wanted to give to Michael's in-laws. I had written it in a hurry right before Robert went into the hospital. That had been the last time Michael had thanked me for anything, and even then it was over the phone, quick and distracted. I closed the ledger and held it for a moment, the weight of it solid in my hands. My reflection in the glossy dryer door looked back at me, the lines around my mouth deeper than I remembered. I thought about Michael's voice in the living room earlier that week, calm and firm as he told me to sell my home. I thought about the way Vanessa had looked around like she was already deciding what to do with the space. A part of me wanted to march over to their house and lay the ledger on the table in front of them. I could imagine the way the color might drain from Michael's face, the awkward silence. But that would be too easy for them to dismiss, to talk their way around. This was not a conversation for now. This was information to be kept protected until I decided how to use it. I slid the ledger back into the drawer, locking it this time. My hand rested on the cool metal for a moment before I straightened. The light in the kitchen had shifted, longer shadows reaching across the floor. I walked back through the dining room, my eyes catching on Robert's chair at the end of the table. For years he had sat there, his hand tapping lightly on the wood while we talked about everything and nothing. There was no one to hear it now, but I still whispered under my breath as I passed the chair. There will be no next time. The phone rang just as I was rinsing a coffee cup in the sink. I dried my hands quickly and picked it up, surprised to see Chloe's name on the screen. She didn't usually call in the middle of the afternoon. "Hi, honey," I said, but her voice came fast and low, like she was afraid someone might overhear her. "Grandma, I need to tell you something, and you can't let on that you know." I stopped moving, leaning against the counter. She told me she had just come home from class and had passed through the kitchen where her parents were talking. They didn't hear her come in. Michael was saying it would be best to get me to sign the papers before summer, before I got too attached to the idea of staying. Vanessa was agreeing, suggesting they frame it as a safety concern. My chest tightened as Chloe spoke, but I stayed quiet, letting her finish. She hesitated before adding, "They're serious, Grandma." It sounded like they've been planning this for a while. I could hear the hurt in her voice, the same disbelief I had felt when Michael first brought it up. "I'm not going anywhere," I told her softly. She let out a breath that sounded almost like relief. "Good," she said, "because you're the only person who's ever made me feel like I was really home." Her words hit something deep in me. She went on to tell me about a class she was taking this semester on historic preservation. She'd been learning about how certain houses could be registered as part of a town's heritage, making it harder for them to be altered or sold without meeting strict guidelines. She thought my house might qualify, especially given Robert's woodworking and the age of the structure. "That could be an option," she said carefully. "I know you probably don't want to get into a legal mess, but there might be a way to protect it." I asked her to tell me more, and she outlined the process she'd been studying. It would involve paperwork inspections and maybe some community board approval, but she thought she could help me start it quietly. The idea of the house being recognized for its history felt right somehow. It wasn't just about keeping it from Michael and Vanessa, it was about honoring the life built here. We talked for a while longer, shifting to lighter topics for her sake. She told me about a design project she was working on and a new coffee shop she had found near campus. I could hear the background noise of her apartment, the faint hum of a kettle. Before we hung up, she promised she would start gathering information for me. Thank you, Chloe, I said, meaning it more than she probably knew. And remember not a word of this to anyone else. She promised, and when the line went quiet, I stood there with the phone still in my hand for a moment. The kitchen felt different now, like the air was charged. I set the phone down and went to the front window looking out at the street. A few kids were riding bikes, their voices carrying in the cool air. Life was still happening out there, ordinary and unchanged. Inside, everything felt like it was shifting. I went upstairs to Robert's study again, sitting in his chair and looking at the desk. The envelope from the bank was still where I had left it, but I didn't touch it yet. I thought instead about Chloe's determination, about how she had inherited that quiet stubbornness from Robert's side of the family. The late afternoon light stretched across the floor, and I could see the faint marks from where Robert's chair wheels had worn the rug. I rested my hand there for a moment, then stood. If they wanted to make this a matter of signatures and papers, I could do the same. I would just be more careful, more deliberate. And I would only tell one person what I was doing, the one person who had proven she was on my side. It was time to start keeping my own counsel. And Chloe would be the only one to know why. The next morning, I decided to walk into town for coffee. The air was cool but not biting, the kind of early spring chill that hinted at warmer days ahead. Maplewood's main street was quiet at that hour, a few shop owners sweeping their steps, the scent of fresh bread drifting from the bakery. I pushed open the door to Susan's cafe and was greeted by the familiar bell above the frame. Susan looked up from behind the counter, her silver hair pulled back neatly, her reading glasses perched halfway down her nose. "Well, this is a surprise," she said with a smile, wiping her hands on a towel. I slid onto one of the stools at the counter and ordered my usual black coffee. She poured it and set it down, leaning forward on her elbows. "How are you holding up, Eleanor?" The question was gentle, but her eyes searched mine in that way only an old friend's could. I hesitated, then told her a shortened version of what had happened. Michael's visit. His insistence I sell the house, the way he spoke like it was already decided. Susan's smile faded into a thin line. "That's a dangerous road," she said, shaking her head. "There are laws in Vermont to protect seniors from being pressured out of their homes. Elder abuse isn't just about physical harm. Financial exploitation counts too. I had heard of such things in passing but never thought they would apply to me." Susan went on, her voice steady but firm. "If they're pushing you to sign anything, you need to get ahead of it. Talk to a lawyer before you even think about answering them." I sipped my coffee, the bitter taste grounding me. I asked if she knew anyone reliable. She nodded without hesitation. "Baxter and Cole in Burlington," she said. "My cousin used them for her estate planning. Fair, thorough, and not easily intimidated." The bell over the door jingled, and an older man stepped in, leaning heavily on a cane. I recognized him instantly. Henry Lawson. Robert had worked with him at the paper mill decades ago. He had the same steady gaze, though his hair was thinner and his frame a little stooped. Susan greeted him warmly and waved him over. "Henry, you remember Eleanor?" He smiled, clasping my hand in his. We sat together at a corner table, and soon the talk turned to Robert and the old days at the mill. Then, perhaps sensing the undercurrent in my voice, Henry asked what was really on my mind. When I told him, his eyes darkened. He nodded slowly, as if it was a story he already knew too well. "My oldest tried that with me after Margaret passed," he said. "Thought I'd be better off in one of those retirement communities. Safer, he called it. What he meant was easier to sell the house. I asked what he did. Fought like hell to keep it," he said plainly. "And I won. The trick is to know your rights before they start making their moves. Don't wait until you're cornered." His words settled into me like stones finding their place in a wall. He leaned back, his hands wrapped around his mug. "Get someone in your corner, Eleanor. Someone who knows the law and isn't afraid to use it." By the time we finished our coffee, my mind was made up. I would not sit and wait for Michael and Vanessa to decide my fate. As I left the cafe, the sunlight had shifted, catching in the shop windows along the street. I walked home with a steady pace, each step feeling more certain than the last. Back in my kitchen, I opened the drawer where I had locked away the ledger. I took it out along with the folder that held my deed tax statements and insurance papers. I stacked them neatly, the weight of them solid in my hands. In the quiet of the house, I picked up the phone and called Baxter and Cole. The receptionist's voice was bright, almost cheerful, as she booked me an appointment with a man named Thomas Kaufman for later that week. When I hung up, I set the phone down beside the papers. The folder sat there on the table like a promise, and I knew I was finally moving from thoughts to action. 2 days later, I was standing outside a glass and brick building in downtown Burlington, my folder clutched under my arm. The sky was a pale winter blue, and a brisk wind came off the lake tugging at my coat. Inside, the lobby smelled faintly of coffee and polished wood. A young woman at the reception desk greeted me with a practiced smile and asked me to take a seat. The waiting area was warm sunlight spilling across the chairs, and a row of neatly arranged magazines. My fingers traced the edge of the folder in my lap, feeling the weight of the documents inside. It wasn't fear I felt, not exactly. It was the anticipation of finally putting something in motion that could not be undone by a phone call or a visit from Michael. A tall man in his late 30s appeared in the doorway, his tie a deep navy that matched the frame of his glasses. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said, extending his hand. "I'm Thomas Kaufman. Please come in." His office was lined with bookshelves and framed diplomas, but it didn't feel cold. A large window looked out over the street, letting in a wash of light. I sat across from his desk as he opened a legal pad and uncapped a pen. "What can I help you with today, Mrs. Whitfield?" I slid the folder across to him and explained slowly and clearly what I wanted. My house paid in full since 2015 to be placed in a trust for my granddaughter Chloe. Michael to be excluded entirely from the will. No loopholes, no contingencies. I told him about Chloe's support, her studies in historic preservation, and her promise to keep the house in the family. Thomas flipped through the deed, the tax statements, the insurance policies. "Everything here looks in order," he said, glancing up. "You own the property outright, no liens, no mortgages. That makes this much easier." I felt something ease in my chest hearing him say it out loud. He began outlining the steps. The trust would transfer the property to Chloe immediately upon my passing, keeping it separate from any marital or family claims. Even if she married or was pressured, the trust could be written so the house could not be sold without her consent. "I want that in writing," I said. He nodded, making a note. Then he looked at me over the rim of his glasses. "If you want to be absolutely certain, we can add a protective clause. It would stipulate that in the event Chloe faces undue pressure or coercion, legal or otherwise, from any party, the property cannot be sold, transferred, or encumbered in any way. Only she can choose, and only after a set number of years." The idea settled over me like a locked gate swinging shut. "Do it," I told him. We went over the language carefully. His questions were precise. Did I want to leave any personal items to Michael? No. Any financial accounts tied to the house? No. The answers came without hesitation. He scribbled more notes, then slid a draft form toward me. I read every line, my finger moving along the page. Each clause felt like another brick in a wall I was building between my home and Michael's ambitions. When I reached the signature line, my hand was steady. I signed, dated it, and handed it back. Thomas gathered the pages neatly. "We will file this with the county and finalize the trust documents. You'll have certified copies for your records by the end of next week." I stood the folder, now lighter in my hands. "Thank you," I said. I meant it. Not just for the legal work, but for treating my decision as something valid and worth protecting. As I stepped out into the hallway, the cold air from the open door met the warmth on my face. I walked back toward the parking lot with a quiet certainty. The papers were in motion now, and no one but Chloe knew. When I got home, the house felt unusually still, as if it knew I had been out securing its future. I set my bag on the counter and went upstairs to change into a sweater, already thinking about what Chloe had said regarding the preservation paperwork. If we were going to strengthen the case for the house as a protected property, I needed more than just the deed. I needed photographs, records, anything that showed its history. In the attic, the air was cool and smelled faintly of cedar from the old trunks Robert had kept. I pulled the cord for the single bulb, its yellow light spilling over stacks of boxes. My hands moved through labeled cartons, sliding aside holiday decorations and faded blankets, until I found the albums. The leather covers were worn smooth, the pages inside filled with snapshots of decades. Robert sanding the porch rail in the summer of 1987, Michael and Chloe raking leaves under the big maple in the front yard. The kitchen before we remodeled it in 1992 with the original pine cabinets Robert had refinished by hand. I stacked the albums neatly near the attic ladder, then spotted a small tin box on a shelf in the corner. It was one of Robert's catch-all boxes, the kind he never let me organize. I pulled it down, blowing a thin layer of dust from the lid. Inside were old receipts, a pocket knife, a few spare keys, and a flash drive no bigger than my thumb. The plastic was scratched, but the faint label in Robert's handwriting read simply audio. Curious, I took it downstairs to the study and plugged it into the old desktop computer. A single folder appeared on the screen holding one file labeled March 2021. My stomach gave a slow turn. I clicked it, and Robert's voice filled the room, low and steady, greeting someone. Then Michael's voice came unmistakable, casual in a way that made my jaw tighten. He was talking to Vanessa, their voices close to the recorder. Michael was saying he thought I would be easier to convince once I started slowing down once I got tired of keeping up the place. Vanessa agreed, saying we could always push the safety angle, make it sound like it's for her own good. The air in the room felt heavier. They spoke about timing, about how the market was climbing, and it would be best to get the house listed before another winter set in. The casual certainty in their tone made my skin prickle. Robert hadn't said much during the exchange, only a few quiet responses, but the recording caught enough to make it clear he had known they were planning something. When the file ended, I sat back, staring at the screen. My pulse was steady, but a cold clarity settled over me. This was more than suspicion now. This was proof. If things ever came to a legal fight, this could be the piece that tipped it. I copied the file onto a new flash drive, then burned it onto a CD for good measure. Both went into a small fireproof lockbox along with the original drive. I carried the box to the bedroom where the old safe sat in the closet behind Robert's suits. The combination clicked under my fingers, the heavy door swinging open. Inside, next to our marriage certificate and a few envelopes of savings bonds, I placed the box carefully. Closing the safe, I spun the dial and let my hand rest there a moment. The knowledge of what I had found settled deep like a weight, but also like armor. I didn't need to tell Chloe about this, not yet. It was enough to know that if the day came when Michael tried to force my hand, I had a weapon he could not talk his way around. The evening light slanted across the study floor, catching the edge of Robert's old desk. I shut off the computer, coiled the cord of the lamp, and left the room with the quiet assurance that I was no longer just protecting the house. I was protecting myself. I was in the kitchen, wiping down the counter, when the sound of tires crunching on the driveway caught my ear. I glanced at the clock. No one was expected, and Chloe always texted before coming over. A moment later, the knock came sharp and quick, followed by the creak of the front door opening before I could answer. Michael stepped in his coat, unbuttoned, his eyes scanning the room as if he were already evaluating it for photographs. Vanessa trailed behind him, her heels clicking on the hardwood, a thin smile on her face that never touched her eyes. "We were in the neighborhood," she said lightly, though they lived nearly 40 minutes away. "Thought we'd stop in and talk." I set the cloth down and faced them. "About what?" Michael exchanged a glance with Vanessa, then took a seat at the dining table without asking. "The market's strong right now, Mom. If we list before summer, we could get top dollar. It would make everything easier for you." "Easier for me," I repeated slowly, letting the words hang in the air. Vanessa slid into the chair beside him, leaning forward. "Think about it. A modern condo in town, no yard work, no repairs. You could have elevator access security, everything you need right at your fingertips." The way she said it made it sound like I was already halfway to an assisted living facility. I felt a flicker of heat under my ribs, but kept my voice steady. "This house is not up for discussion." Vanessa's eyebrows lifted in a faint arch. "We're only trying to help." By taking away my home. Michael's tone hardened. No one's taking anything away. But this place is too much for you now. It's only a matter of time before something happens and you can't manage it. I met his gaze squarely. This is my home. It's not a matter for you to decide. For a second, the room was very still except for the ticking of the clock in the hall. Michael looked as if he wanted to push further to lean on me until I gave ground, but something in my face must have stopped him. Vanessa broke the silence with a small, humorless laugh. You're being stubborn, Eleanor. We're thinking about what's best for you. I straightened in my chair. What's best for me is staying here. And what's best for you is understanding that no one has the right to sell this house except me. Michael's mouth tightened. Mom! I didn't flinch. No one, I said again. The words landed between us like a closed door. Michael finally leaned back, his hand drumming once on the table before he stood. We'll talk later, he said, but it sounded more like a warning than a promise. Vanessa picked up her purse, her eyes sweeping the room one last time as if to memorize it. I walked them to the door, not out of courtesy, but to make sure it shut firmly behind them. Through the window, I watched their car reverse down the drive, the exhaust clouding in the cool air. My reflection in the glass was calm, but my pulse was steady with something sharper than before. They could talk all they wanted. The decision wasn't theirs to make. The next morning, I was up before the sun, the air in the kitchen still cool from the night. I poured myself a cup of coffee, took one slow sip, and then set the mug down untouched. Today was the day I would take back the last bit of control Michael thought he had. I gathered my folder, slipping in the account statements and the paperwork from Baxter and Cole, and drove into Maplewood. The bank was quiet at that hour, only a few customers scattered among the desks. A young teller greeted me and directed me to an office at the back, where a woman with kind eyes and a crisp blazer introduced herself as the branch manager. How can I help you today? Mrs. Whitfield, she asked. I told her clearly and without hesitation that I wanted to revoke any and all powers of attorney, co-signature privileges, and account access previously granted to my son Michael Whitfield. Her pen stilled for a moment before she nodded, pulling a set of forms from her drawer. She walked me through each page, explaining the legal effect of every signature. I read them carefully, my pen moving in deliberate strokes across the lines. When it was done, she gathered the pages, made copies, and slid them back to me with a firm smile. As of now, no one but you has authority over these accounts. The weight that lifted from my shoulders was almost physical. I thanked her, tucked the documents into my folder, and walked out into the pale morning light feeling like the air was cleaner. From there I drove to the post office. The bell over the door chimed as I stepped inside, the scent of paper and cardboard thick in the air. I took one of the cream-colored envelopes I had brought with me, slid in a letter addressed to Michael, and added a copy of the revocation documents. The letter was short and direct, stating that his authority over my finances had been formally and permanently revoked, effective immediately. There would be no exceptions and no discussions. At the counter, a young clerk weighed the envelope and asked if I wanted tracking. Yes, I said. I want to know exactly when it's delivered. She printed the label, affixed it neatly, and handed me the small slip with the tracking number. I folded it into my wallet and stepped outside. The slip felt warm from my hand, like a tiny key to a door I had just closed forever. On the way home, I decided to stop at the little cafe 2 blocks from the square. The glass case at the counter gleamed with pies and pastries, but my eyes went straight to the lemon meringue, its golden peaks catching the light. 1 slice, please, I told the girl behind the counter. I carried it to a small table by the window. The fork sank into the airy topping down through the tart lemon filling, and the first bite was bright and sharp on my tongue. It was not celebration in the loud toasting kind of way. It was quieter than that, a private acknowledgement that I had untied a knot that had been pulling tighter for years. Outside, the street moved on with its usual rhythm, cars gliding past, people carrying paper cups of coffee, the ordinary life of the town. I finished the last bite slowly, savoring the sweetness and the subtle tang. When I left the cafe, the sun had risen higher, casting long light down Main Street. I walked to my car without rushing, the tracking slip still in my wallet, a silent reminder that some ties could be cut clean, and once they were, they stayed cut. 2 days later, the phone rang just after breakfast. I saw Michael's name on the screen, and for a moment considered letting it go to voicemail. Curiosity won, and I pressed the green button. His voice came through sharp and tight. "What are you thinking, Mom? Do you realize you're breaking this family apart?" I set my coffee cup down and leaned back in the chair. "No," I said evenly. "I'm protecting it from being torn apart." There was a pause on the other end, then a scoff. "From your own son." "This is insane. People are going to think you've lost it." I didn't raise my voice. "People can think whatever they like. My affairs are my own." He muttered something under his breath, then ended the call without a goodbye. The line went dead, and the quiet of the kitchen seemed to grow heavier. I exhaled slowly, letting the sound of the clock ticking steady me. Not long after, my phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from Vanessa. It read, "Everyone in town will know soon enough what you've been up to." The words were followed by a little smiley face, the kind meant to look harmless but felt more like a threat. I read it twice, then slid the phone face down on the table. Let them talk. Gossip has a short life unless you feed it, and I had no intention of giving them more. Still, the pressure was there, pressing in from both sides. The rest of the morning, I moved through the house with deliberate purpose. In the study, I pulled the safe key from its place in the kitchen drawer and opened the heavy door. The lockbox with the USB recording was still inside, tucked neatly beside the certified copies of the trust documents and the revocation papers from the bank. I stacked them in a canvas tote, then added the deed, Robert's will, and the marriage certificate. The tote went into the hall closet right behind the box of winter scarves. Easy to reach, but not obvious to anyone poking around. I stood there a moment, my hand resting on the strap, before closing the door. The afternoon passed in a quiet rhythm. I dusted the shelves in the living room, watered the plants in the sunroom, and baked a small loaf of bread. Every so often my phone would buzz with another message, but I left it untouched. Their noise could wait. By evening, the smell of warm bread filled the house. I sliced a piece for myself, the crust crisp under the knife, and sat at the table watching the light fade from the windows. The documents were where they needed to be. The evidence was secure. If they wanted to push harder, they would find me ready. The knock on the door came hard enough to rattle the glass. I wiped my hands on a dish towel and opened it to find Michael on the porch. His jaw set tight. "We need to talk," he said, stepping past me before I could answer. He stopped in the middle of the living room, turning to face me. "I want to know what's going on, why you're doing all this." I folded my arms, keeping my voice steady. "You want to know? Fine. Let's start with the $20,000 I gave you for your down payment. Then the $6,200 for Chloe's tuition, $4,000 for her braces, $10,000 to fix your roof when you said you couldn't afford it, $39,000 in smaller temporary loans you never paid back." He blinked, caught off guard, but I didn't stop. "That doesn't include the vacations, the holiday checks, or the $2,500 I gave Vanessa for her certification course." His expression tightened. "That's not the point. It's exactly the point. You have taken, and not once since your father died have you asked me how I'm doing. Not once." He looked away, his hands curling into fists. "This is Chloe, isn't it? She's filling your head, making you think I'm the enemy." I almost laughed at the absurdity. Chloe has done nothing but treat me with respect. The decisions I've made are mine, Michael. No one else's. He stepped closer, his voice low. "You're making a mistake." "No," I said, meeting his eyes. "The house will go to Chloe. That is settled. No one can change it." For a moment, the only sound was the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Then he let out a short, bitter breath and shook his head. "You'll regret this." I didn't move as he turned on his heel and walked to the door. The slam reverberated through the hallway, rattling a frame on the wall. Through the front window, I watched him cross the yard, his shoulders tight, his steps sharp. He didn't look back, and I didn't expect him to. The anger in his face had been matched only by the flicker of something else. Frustration. Maybe even defeat. The next afternoon, Chloe's car pulled into the driveway, sunlight glinting off the hood. She stepped out with a rolled-up sheet of paper under her arm and a smile that reached her eyes. I wiped my hands on a dish towel and met her at the door. "I brought something for you," she said, unrolling the paper on the dining table. It was a detailed sketch of the front porch, complete with new railing designs and wide steps framed by planters. "I thought we could fix it up for summer, make it a place you'll want to sit every evening." I studied the lines, the careful shading, the way she had preserved the original look, while adding small touches to make it sturdier and more inviting. "Robert would have loved this," I said quietly. She looked up a little surprised at the softness in my tone, and I realized this was the right moment. I went to the study and returned with a large manila envelope. Inside was a certified copy of the trust, along with the protective clauses Thomas had added. I slid it toward her. "This is yours to keep, Chloe. It explains exactly what will happen with the house when I'm gone." She hesitated, her fingers resting on the edge of the envelope. "Are you sure you want me to have this now?" I nodded. "I want you to understand not just what it means, but the responsibility that comes with it. This house isn't just walls and wood. It's every holiday, every morning coffee with your grandfather, every story told on that porch. Now it's protected." Her eyes softened, and she placed her hand over mine. "I promise I'll take care of it." A quiet ease settled in my chest. For months, I had been bracing against the constant push from Michael and Vanessa, the feeling of being cornered in my own home. But here with Chloe, there was no need for defense. Only trust. Word had already begun to spread in town. A neighbor mentioned over the fence that she'd heard Michael was no longer in my will. I didn't confirm or deny it. Rumors have their own way of moving, and the less I touched them, the more they seemed to work on their own. I knew Michael cared about appearances. Having people know he had been cut out would sting in a way I didn't need to witness to believe. Later, Chloe and I carried 2 chairs onto the porch. The boards creaked under our steps, familiar and steady. She talked about her summer courses while I watched the garden beds edging into bloom. Tulips were opening their colors bright against the dark soil, and the air held the faint scent of lilac. When she left, I stayed on the porch, the envelope still on the table beside me. The sun dipped lower, spilling gold light across the yard. I drew in a slow breath, feeling the tension that had sat in my shoulders for months finally begin to ease. The house was safe, and so was I. If you've ever faced a moment where you had to stand your ground to protect what mattered most, I'd love to hear your story. Share your experiences in the comments, and if this one spoke to you, stay with us for more stories about finding strength, holding your place, and keeping your history alive.